Hello everyone, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today is part 1 of a new Let's Play series. As you can all tell, we're returning to cold waters after a bit of a hiatus, and the new game will be playing through the 1968 campaign. Now, for those of you who may have missed some of the earlier videos of mine, Cold Waters is a real-time, I wouldn't call it a simulation, but it's a real-time submarine action game that puts you in charge of a U.S. nuclear submarine during a hypothetical Third World War. In many ways, the game is the spiritual successor to Red Storm Rising, which was a classic war game in the early 90s, which was very loosely based off of the Tom Clancy book of the same name. Now, in this game, this almost feels more authentically tied to Red Storm Rising, in the sense that the Soviet Union has initiated a Third World War. Today's video and the start of this new series are going to be looking at a campaign that I really haven't had much success with yet. That is the 1968 campaign, and I am using the stock game. I know there's some modifications out there that allow you to play with a wide range of new submarines, such as I believe the Barble class submarine, in the last American diesels, as well as future or current day submarines like the Seawolf class or the Virginias. Additionally, there's a Russian modification which allows you to play as Russian submarines. Although a month or two ago when I was playing this game a lot more frequently, the developers did say a Russian campaign is coming, so I'm kind of holding off on playing as the Russians. Also, I don't think it's that interesting playing as the Russians when you're fighting other Russians. I think playing as the Russians would be far more interesting if I was playing against the Americans, but since that's not currently, to my knowledge, available in a modification, I'm going to stick with a stock game. Now, in this particular video, I'm going to be playing as a captain of a U.S. Sturgeon class submarine. Fast attack submarine made by the U.S. Navy in the 1960s. It was sort of the precursor to the Los Angeles class, the backbone of the fleet, at a time where the U.S. was really just beginning to get its massive advantage in terms of acoustic characteristics, where the U.S. really took a huge lead over the Soviet submarines in terms of both sonar and in terms of noise reduction technology. You'd really see that come to culmination in the 1970s and 1980s under the Los Angeles class, but the Sturgeon was sort of that first class of submarines. The Sturgeon isn't without its own drawbacks, however, given that it is a slower submarine. It's not as fast as the Los Angeles or as some of the earlier submarines like the Skipjack, but it definitely has more survivability in the ability to remain stealthy. The biggest challenge for the Sturgeon, however, is if it is detected and the enemy does launch weapons against it, it's just not as quick or nimble as the Skipjack class, the earlier class of submarines, which is almost like driving a Mustang under the water. It's big, it's loud, everybody's hearing you coming, but on the flip side, you can bust out of there really quick. With that being said, that's kind of the intro for this campaign. We're playing the 1968 campaign, which puts you in a hypothetical Third World War where the Russians use the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War, the US's distraction in the Vietnam War against America, and they launch a surprise attack on Western Europe when the US's resources are really focused elsewhere. This is a much less technology-rich campaign than the 1980s. The 1980s campaign is kind of just point, click, and shoot. This campaign is a lot more finesse, especially when you're dealing with surface threats. You actually have a dumb torpedo, the Mark 16, which is basically a World War II type torpedo, a modification of the Mark 14, the US's main torpedo during World War II, is your principal anti-surface weapon. So you've got to get really close in, and it's very difficult to fight against surface vessels. It's also got a weaker torpedo for dealing with enemy submarines, in that the Mark 37, while it's acoustic, it can hear enemy subs, it can follow them, it's wire guided, unlike the Mark 16, which is just a dumb torpedo. The Mark 37 has some brains behind it. The challenge with it is that it's so slow, you basically have to just get in close within like 1,000 yards of your enemy, get in behind them so they can't hear you when you fire your torpedo, and shoot a torpedo, up the enemy's rear. Additionally, it has a very weak warhead, so it typically takes multiple torpedo hits to sink an enemy submarine. This video, however, is 5 minutes in, and I'm not really addressing the topic of the video, so this is the start of my attempt to make things a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more intelligent, for lack of a better words. I want to mix in sort of those Ultimate General videos, which are just kind of more casual, or at least the ones I've been doing thus far, with some more thoughtful videos, and this is going to be one of those, I think. Today I'm going to be reviewing a book, which is, go figure, about submarines. That's why I'm playing this game while I'm reviewing this book. While I'm reviewing this book. And the book that I'm going to be talking about in today's video is called Red November. Red November is a 2010 book written by Craig Reed, a former U.S. Navy diver, which is similar to Blind Man's Bluff in the sense that the book is really trying to take you through the U.S. submarine war against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It's trying to get you to understand the espionage operations which are taking place during the Cold War. And it does talk about some stories which are already sort of widely known. It talks about U.S. Cable tapping operations which occurred against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, in which U.S. submarines would basically have divers go place some devices on undersea cables close into the Soviet shore, which would then allow the U.S. to record conversations that were occurring by the Soviet Union and its high command without the Soviets having any idea of it. Additionally, the book talks about things like the Soviet Union coming very close to using nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Foxtrot submarines there being, having one of their commanders actually issue the order to prepare to fire a nuclear-tipped torpedo. The book talks about some other events, such as the sinking of the Soviet submarine K-129, a accident which occurred off the coast of the United States, in which a Russian submarine carrying nuclear weapons, was sunk. Not, sunk on its own accord or to some effect. And the U.S. Navy's attempt to retrieve that submarine via some CIA operations, in which they attempted to raise the submarine from the surface with I believe it was called the Glomar Explorer, a Howard Hughes initiative there, and how that was kept very secret. The book, however, has some dubious claims, not just with the K-129, but in general. At times it just doesn't seem believable, and not in a, wow, this seems a little far-fetched and it's really well backed up. But the way that the book is written seems a little bit too self-serving, in my view, to the author. And I could be completely wrong here. Maybe some of these discussions are just outright fanciful, but true. It's certainly possible. I'm reading another book right now called Skunk Works, which is about the sort of the secret design shop by Lockheed, now Lockheed Martin, which was used to develop the F-117, used to develop the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71. And there's certainly some stories in there that it talks about that seem like, wait a minute, shouldn't we have heard about some of these things? Secret dogfights between U.S. aircraft and the Soviets ahead of the development of the U-2, where the U.S. was trying to spy on Russia, but these craft weren't yet high enough flying or fast enough, so there were dogfights that were classified that were occurring between U.S. and Soviet aircraft. Or a story of a U.S. U-2 pilot overflying a Soviet nuclear test range just hours before a nuclear test occurred, and they had no idea this range even existed. In general, certain just seemingly too wild to be true, such as a U.S. C-130 landing on a deserted airstrip in, I think it was Iran, with air personnel basically going out with weapons to secure this location in a bandit-run location in Iran, I think it was, and then a U-2 landing there so they could refuel. These kind of things which seem like they're straight out of a spy novel. Red November seems full of these things, and I would find the book more believable. I'm reading Skunk Works, which is a memoir, which I'll probably end up reviewing at some point down the line, of the individual who's running Skunk Works after what is his name? Something Kelly. After the initial sort of designer of Skunk Works left, this was sort of his successor, and he developed the F-117. This book, however, is more believable because it parcels in not just his own personal stories, it's not just the author sort of self-serving himself, but he brings in additional other sources, multiple pilots, It seems more reputable when you have 5 or 6 different people backing up your claims and talking about how they related to them. My challenge with Red November is that it's a book about a submarine diver that goes out of its way to really focus and glorify the role of submarine divers during the Cold War. Fine, I get it, but it doesn't really back those claims up. It has some really interesting pieces in it that I think seem reputable and also seem to be worthwhile. It talks about sort of the radar direction finding of U.S. submarines. It talks about how U.S. operations by this individual's, I think it was his father, in Turkey were vital to the Cold War. It talks about some, again, somewhat fanciful operations of special commandos and intelligence missions going on in Greece. So there's certainly a lot of information here. It's really hard to understand what is reputable and what isn't because, and this is really where I'm getting to, is one, it's highly personalized based on one individual's take, but the flip side of that, and sort of what makes me less likely to take it seriously, is how many facts the author just gets wrong. He mentions that the Chinese Navy has 30 ballistic missile submarines, not 30 submarines, not 30 nuclear-powered submarines, but 30 Chinese SSBNs, which I suppose could be possible if you assume all of the publicly available information is wildly inaccurate, but the scope and scale at which it's inaccurate just seems a little bit fanciful. The Chinese, according to open sources, have 4 SSBNs. And they, well, 5 if you include, they've got like a test golf platform. But they've got 4, and they didn't start coming into commission until 2007. They have maybe 8 planned, but how you get 30 out of that just seems insane. Additionally, he makes some claims which are widely sort of dubious. So the USS Skipjack, the USS Skipjack, which was a nuclear-powered submarine, which sunk mysteriously in the early 1960s, late 1950s. There are multiple different theories around how the Skipjack sunk, and ranging from being sunk by the Soviets, colliding with a Soviet submarine, a faulty torpedo that detonated in the submarine. There's a bunch of different theories. And one of the theories that used to be sort of purported was that the Soviets sank the Skipjack in retaliation for the previously mentioned sinking of the Soviet K-129, which was generally, in the last 10 to 15 years, has been regarded as not plausible. That didn't happen. There's, the Navy has had multiple theories. No one's sure. But the way the author portrays it is he draws a very clear line. He talks about the sinking of the Soviet K-129. He then says that there were dire consequences for a U.S. submarine as a result of that sinking. And then he portrays it as a Soviet submarine sinking the U.S. Skipjack-class submarine. Only at the end does he throw sort of a throwaway line in there about that being one of the potential ways that it sunk. He portrayed it as fact, and then sort of wiggled in a little bit of a line in there about how, well, basically if someone came to criticize him to say this isn't even the presumed likely theory, he had already presented as fact, but he's got one line in there where he can be like, well, that's not really what I said. I said that was one possible way that it could have been, even though I just spent 10 pages talking about why, that's what actually happened. But that's not the only thing. I mean, just in general, it seems like he continually screws up designations between megatons and kilotons, especially when talking about the yields of nuclear torpedoes. 30 kiloton nuclear torpedo yields versus, he calls them 30 megatons. And just the details don't seem credible. And again, that's why it makes me a little uneasy with taking a lot of what he says at face value. It's written in an interesting style, I will say. The book is written in a first-person perspective very frequently, whether he's talking about his father in Turkey and the operations there, whether he's talking about his own experiences in a submarine. It's well written and compelling, but when you constantly get verifiable facts like missing megatons and kilotons, screwing those up, promoting theories which in general have been widely discredited or at least called into question, and promoting them as facts, when you just get blatant statistics vastly wrong, basically creating an SSBN gap where there isn't one. We would know if the Soviets, or if not the Soviets, if the Chinese had 30 SSBNs, considering that would be double what the U.S. has, and there's just no one saying anything like that. So unless he's revealing highly classified information that dramatically alters the scale of the U.S. military balance, which seems unlikely, it's just hard to believe. I mean, in his own portrayals of his actions as a diver, he kind of comes up, and I'm not saying it's totally fabricated, with this fanciful description of how, his submarine was trying to get pictures of I think it was a Soviet submarine that was on the surface, but they couldn't get it right because of the angle of the light, and his captain was going to send him out of a torpedo tube so that he could float to the surface, and in the surface, just like in a dinghy or swimming on the surface, just take like a manual picture. Like, it's one thing to say divers get sent out on the floor of the ocean to put a what do you call it, a monitoring device on a cable, on an undersea cable. It's very different to say a submarine's going to be moving, it's going to shoot you out of a torpedo tube, you're going to go to the surface and take a picture with basically a Polaroid of the enemy submarine, and then you're going to get recovered all inside of, I think it was Vladivostok. I suppose that would be plausible, sort of, maybe, if your captain was crazy, and maybe, certainly crazy things happened during the Cold War, but if all of your other facts or statistics that you've mentioned previously in this book are called into question, it just makes that kind of a claim much less credible. So I enjoyed the writing of Red November. I found it a interesting read. I learned more about sort of the way that radio direction finding was unfolding in the early Cold War, how the U.S. had to struggle to try and identify where Soviet submarines were, how they did that stuff, while available in other sources and just kind of rehashed here, like the Soviet explanation of, or the Soviet submarines during the Cold War. All of these were facts or figures or stories that I had heard in other locations, and were really just kind of brought together in one location here in this book. Those were all interesting, but it's just, again, one of those things where when you start talking about his own participation in these operations, I don't know, it didn't seem terribly credible and believable to me. So overall, I know I've been spending the last 10 plus minutes saying how wrong or how misguided this book feels. Overall, it was an interesting read, and I don't necessarily disregard it or not recommend it. I would just take a lot of what you read in there, especially the personalized stories about his father and about himself. I would just recommend, when you're reading those portions of the book, take them with a grain of salt. And when you're thinking about, he's talking about certain statistical figures and promoting them as fact, I would take those with a bit of a grain of salt, because he kind of has a tendency in the book to really play fast and loose with the facts. And if you're going to be writing sort of a revealing book, and he's portraying this book as I'm revealing secrets that no one else has talked about, and I have value that Blind Man's Bluff didn't have, and Blind Man's Bluff was sort of the initial preeminent espionage reveal book, talking about secret U.S. submarine operations during the Cold War, and kind of revealing a lot of that for the first time. He even talks in his introduction about how this book is important because Blind Man's Bluff doesn't go far enough in revealing what happened, and enough time has passed that we need to reveal some of these events. But if your argument is this is sort of a sneak peek into the world of espionage, then to me, the facts and the details matter, and if you don't do your due diligence to get that stuff right, then I have to question the rest of what you did, because are you just exaggerating? Are you misleading? What's the real motivation here? Is it just building up yourself, or what? I'm not sure. Overall, entertaining book, interesting read. Be careful about what it says and what it claims as fact. And if you read something and it doesn't seem right, do a little bit of back checking to figure out, is there any verification for this? Because I wouldn't trust it on the surface by itself. Anyway, that's my thought. I've put a link into the description for this book, so if you do decide you want to purchase it or check it out, you can click on that link. It is an affiliate link through Amazon, so I do get a small cut if you do buy it, although I don't think anyone would claim, based on sort of my take and as critical as I've been of this over the last 15 or so minutes, I don't think anyone would say that I'm promoting you to read a book that is bad, but I'm portraying it as good just so I can make a little bit of money. I've been pretty frank and pretty honest, I think, about my thoughts of the book. I don't feel like my money was wasted. I feel like it was entertaining and an interesting read. I don't think it did a good enough job doing its homework. And the other piece that really makes me a little uneasy, again, is his complete lack of using other sources. He uses secondary stories about the Soviets during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, or other well-known occurrences, and it sort of relies on secondary sources there. But when he really gets into the piece of the book that he could provide value on, his own personal experiences, he doesn't have really any other individuals that he talks about that can corroborate his story. If he had 2 or 3 other individuals in the book talking about how they were related to some of those stories, what their involvement was, then it would be more believable, just as in Skunk Works, where you have sort of the protagonist, the individual whose memoir it is, who talks for 30 pages about what happened, but then you also have this other voices section of the book that brings 5 or 6 other people that basically tell their perspective of the same exact story, which makes that much more believable than in Red November. Nonetheless, if you are interested in submarine books, you are interested in the Cold War, I recommend it just as sort of a point of reference to understand where it's coming from and maybe think about some things that you might want to dig into a little bit more depth. But just if it's your first time getting into the Cold War submarine world and that level of books, just make sure you're taking the book with the appropriate grain of salt. That being said, that's enough of me rambling and kind of chit-chatting about it. I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and head off into the sunset, and we will continue this series next time around. I will also say that this Cold Water series isn't strictly going to be a book review series. This was part 1. This is what I wanted to talk about first, but I'm also going to be returning to doing the histories of the various classes of submarines. So we kind of left out around the beginning of the nuclear age with our last series. So we will pick up the submarine force, talking about various classes of ships, their strengths, their weaknesses, the development of new classes of warships, and whatnot as we move forward. Just recognize that I may have an occasional book review, I may have an occasional video that's talking about the history or the details of a specific submarine class, and then there will be days where maybe I just have a casual conversation as I play through the game. My goal is with this campaign to play all the way through in the 1968 campaign as I did with the 1980s campaign, but we'll see how feasible that is because I have struggled mightily in 5 or 6 attempts to play this campaign. I've never gotten all the way through. So we'll see how it works out. But with that being said, guys, I once again appreciate you tuning in, appreciate you watching. Feel free to leave your thoughts below. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.